Hey everyone! We are now going to take some notes for chapter one, all right? And these are going to be notes that you use for the entire chapter, okay? So they're all going to be in one spot on a Google Doc. And then once you make the Google Doc, you're going to save it to your social studies folder, okay? And we should have made the folder um, a few days ago. So hopefully that's set up for you. If it's not, that's okay. You can make one right now, okay? So you are going to now pull up your Chromebooks and start a Google Doc that you're going to title Chapter 1 Notes, okay? So if you can see up here at the top, I have my Chapter 1 notes. So go ahead and do that. And I'm going to start us off, okay? And we're just going to work right through this together. And so you have all the information that you need, okay? So what we're going to do to start it off here is I'm going to go to the middle of the page. All right, so as you can see, my little blinking line is right in the middle there. And we're going to title this Chapter 1 Notes, all right? Make sure you choose a font that's easy to read. Personally, I like Lato. Now we're going to bold, italicize, and underlined because we want this to pop. This is our header, okay? So you want to know what these notes are about, Chapter 1 Notes, okay? And now what we want to do is we always want to date our notes, okay? So you know exactly when you took these um, notes and you can refer back to them more easily, okay? So what we're going to do now is enter, and then I'm going to take off the bold, italicize, and underline 'cause it's not necessary anymore. Doesn't need to pop. And I'm going to go over here to the right align, okay? So if you go to right align, it'll jump right over to the right side of the paper, which is where we want it. Now, once you go ahead and put the date. What is the date? If you're my class, you like to ask me that. And I say on the board, September 24. Can you believe it's almost done with September already? Crazy. All right, so September 24, I have my notes dated. It's all set. Now I'm going to enter, and go back to the left side of the page. So I'm going to push left align. And now my little blinking line should be on the left side of the page. And that's all we're going to do for now. So go ahead and take your hands off the keys. We are all set. Go ahead and look at this with me. Turn your eyes to the screen. So let's go and let's look at primary and secondary sources, okay? So here we are with our primary and secondary sources. I just want to talk about the word primary first, all right? So primero en español. Does anyone know what that means? I don't even know if that's correct exactly, but I do remember from my Spanish in high school that primero means first in Spanish. Interesting. All right, so also the word primary comes from the Latin root word primus, which means first. All right? And the Latin word primarius means of the first rank, chief, principal, excellent. So we can see that this primary word means first, and that's going to be key when we're thinking about primary sources because these are the sources that come from the very original time period or the very original event. All right, so it's right there, a first-hand account. All right, and then secondary sources kind of goes without saying. Secondary, you're the second person to share the information, okay? So you are someone who heard about something from someone else and then you're sharing it with someone. So it happened through, you're telling the story through multiple people, okay? So that's the secondary source. Secondary sources often gain their information from primary sources, all right? Let's look at some examples because that might clear it up a little bit. So first we have our primary sources. We'll go back to that slide. Primary sources. So let's look at this first picture at the top. This is probably one of the most famous diaries of all time, the Diary of Anne Frank. Okay, many of you may know who this is, but Anne Frank was someone who lived during World War II and she was in hiding for 2 years from Nazis. Okay, and she lived in the Netherlands. So she kept a very detailed account of this experience through her diary, and now it's located at the museum in Amsterdam. Okay, and I believe you can also tour the house where she was in hiding. All right. So, this diary is a first-hand account and it was written by Anne Frank. So, it's a primary source. All right. The next example we have here, Native American drawings from Southern California. All right. So these are from the time period of the Native Americans that lived in Southern California. So it's a primary source, okay? It's not someone giving you a report about the Native Americans. Like, no, this is the actual writings or pictures that they drew. All right, so it's a primary source. This picture right here is a picture of part of the beach and Lake Michigan right here in Muskegon, Michigan. All right. If you notice, there are some railroad tracks there. Well, that's because there used to be a railroad that ran right along Lake Michigan Beach. Okay. And that's because during the 1860s, Charles Hackley was building Muskegon, and he had a huge lumber company. And that lumber was transported up and down the beach using the railroad. Okay. So we don't find any railroad tracks anymore, but historians do believe that they're still there underneath the sand. But with erosion and the water levels changing, they just got buried. But as you can see, the beach was once much larger than it is now, and there was railroad tracks there, and that's how Muskegon came to be what it is today. Okay, and then lastly we have, and that is a primary source because it's a photograph from the time period. Okay, and then we have a dinosaur fossil, which was found in China. Okay, and this, I'm sure you've heard of fossils being a prime, maybe a an ancient artifact, and that's because they are. They're something that we can see from a way long time ago. Okay, and so that's an example of a dinosaur fossil. So let's go back to our chapter one notes, and we're going to now write about primary sources. Okay. So go back to your chapter one notes now. You should have your tab on the right side, okay? And I'm now going to type my first term, primary source. And because this is a term, we're going to bold or underline, whichever you prefer, something that makes it pop, okay? So I like to bold and underline, but you can do whichever you prefer. Go ahead and take the bold and underline off. We're going to dash. And here's our definition. Evidence gathered from the actual site or the real people that lived through the historical event and time period. All right? Give you a second to get that down. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to. And now we're going to look at some examples, okay? So that you can refer back to these notes when you are studying chapter one. So I'm going to go ahead and enter twice. Enter, enter, 2 spaces down. I'm going to use this bullet point over here. You can use the number system, you can use a bullet point, you can use dashes, whichever you prefer. I like the bullet points personally. And my first example is photographs, just like that one of Muskegon. My second example, go ahead and enter. Eyewitness accounts. Go ahead and enter. Next example, artwork, like the Native American drawings we found. Parentheses, carvings, paintings, etchings. Parentheses. Enter. Artifacts. Okay. Enter fossils. And then lastly, original documents. And examples of original documents Could be your birth certificate, okay? The diary example, all right? Letters from the time period, all right? So go ahead and give those examples too. It'll help you out. All right, go ahead and pause the video. Let everyone catch up with those notes, and then we'll continue on and talk about secondary sources. All right, let's go to secondary sources now. So here are some examples. Secondary sources. First, let's look at your textbook, all right? Your textbook is a secondary source. Ancient world history. That's because all the authors of the textbook, they gathered information from multiple resources, okay? And they did a lot of research to put together a whole book of information. Do you think the authors of our textbook were around for all the events we're going to cover in ancient world history? Probably not. Probably hardly any of it at all, in fact. But that doesn't matter. They've gathered information and it's now a secondary resource for us to study, okay? That's your textbook. Another example of a secondary source would be an article written by someone who was not at an event, okay? So here's a personal example. My sister played basketball at Fruitport Calvary Christian, and she had an article written about her last year when she was a senior there. And you can't really see the name, but his name is Scott DeCamp down here at the bottom. He was a reporter for M Live, okay? So, what happens after a sporting event, the reporters, if they aren't at the event, which often they're not, they call up the coach, and they call up the coach and they say, "Oh, hey coach, great win tonight. Could you give us a few quotes? What happened during the game that really gave you guys a boost to finish strong? Or do you have any names of girls that played really well, or had any stats that are worth noting in the article?" And then the coach goes back, "Oh, yeah, Scott, so it was a great game. I just want to, talk about so and so who had, a team high of 10 rebounds and we all we did really was we just stuck to the game plan and we fought our way back into it, blah blah blah." Okay, so that's a conversation that's happening between someone who was not at an event, someone who was in an event, and what comes out of it is an article that's a secondary source, okay? And there you have it. Secondary source on a basketball game that happened at Football Calvary Christian. And now people that read the article are gaining their information from someone who wasn't there, but gathered the information from people who were. And then lastly, we have the George Washington His Excellency book, which is a fantastic read. I would highly suggest it. But it's a book about George Washington's life. And the author, Joseph Ellis, he wasn't around during George Washington's life, but he wrote a book about him based off primary sources that he found, like George Washington's letters, his taxes, his legal documents, things found in his house, like artifacts from the 1700s. Okay, so this book is another example of a secondary source. So let's go back to our chapter 1 notes. And now we're going to talk about secondary sources. So go ahead and enter, enter. So we want a space in between our examples and secondary sources. All right, and let's go ahead and type secondary source. And what are we going to do with this term? Bold and underline. All right, and then we're going to take the bold and underline off, dash, and here's your definition. Details recorded after an event occurs, comma, documents are recorded by someone who was not actually at the event. So go ahead and get that typed out. Now we're going to do the same thing we did before, enter, and I'm going to do a bullet point. All right. All right, here's your first example. Article written by a news reporter. So that's the example I gave with my sister. All right. Next example, oh, it'd be helpful if you could see it. Retelling a story secondhand. Right. And that happens, I'm sure, in middle school all the time. So you understand what that means when someone retells you a story that they heard from someone else. Scholarly books and articles. All right, so that would be the George Washington, His Excellency book example. And then the next example, social studies textbooks. All right. And then lastly, we're going to add reports that interpret events. Right. So these could be reports on events, and they could be opinion articles or um, reports based off research, stuff like that. All right. Great job today, guys. Go ahead and pause the video if you need more time to finish up those notes, but that's all we've got for today. So your final product should look a little bit something like this. Awesome job. See ya tomorrow.